you go. And now we'll head across another seat. So to Shane, who's in Northern Ireland from the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, and who I went over to see a couple of weeks ago now at Stormont for the publication of a new guide that, oops, get the right one on the screen. There we go. Designing homes for all. Inclusive design guide to support people living with cognitive and sensory impairments. So over to you, Shane.
Yes, Paul, and thank you very much for the invite. I thoroughly enjoyed that presentation from Per Olaf. So much of it resonated with what we were trying to do, with what we produced in terms of our guide. I was really interested in your question because it was a question I would have asked about. Have you thought, how would you apply those principles in terms of home design, which is really what we've tried to do through the development of our guide. And I suppose it's titled Designing Homes for All. We refer to inclusive design, and we call it an inclusive design guide, which is really focusing on supporting people with cognitive and sensory impairment. And I'll talk about the reasons why we have focused on that here in Northern Ireland. My role, actually, I'm a head of housing and health. So I'm actually jointly employed by the Department of Health and the Housing Executive. The Housing Executive, or the Strategic Housing Authority here in Northern Ireland. So a good part of my role has been looking at policy strategy and how housing and health interface in the delivery of housing solutions for people with disabilities, really. So this work really, our guide evolved from a previous review with things. The wheels of industry don't move as quickly as you would like sometimes, but there was a review of interdepartmental review of housing adaptations carried out 10 years ago, believe it or not, in Northern Ireland by both departments, the Department for Communities, who have responsibility for housing, and the Department of Health. And one of the recommendations that sat within that review highlighted that we needed to develop new areas of disability design to complement adaptations design communications toolkit and to inform new build design guidance, design for the mind, design for sight loss. Because what we're reasonably good at, I have to say, in Northern Ireland is we have quite good guidance around accessibility, which probably all regions have in terms of ramps, doorways, corridors, room sizes, those sort of basic accessibility features that we're all familiar with. And as an occupational therapist over many years, I have been involved in making recommendations primarily for adaptations, but also involved in new build home design for accessibility. But we recognized that we weren't so good at, in fact, we were quite poor at looking at the design needs of people, and and that variation that Per Olaf talked about, and the usability element around people with behaviors, cognitive, sensory impairment, because some of the biggest challenges, in fact, the majority of our biggest challenges in finding appropriate housing solutions in Northern Ireland at the moment are for people with behaviors. People with mobility impairment are relatively straightforward in terms of finding a solution, but people with behaviors and behaviors that are impacted by the environment that they're being cared for are way more challenging in finding solutions. So we knew there was work to be done in terms of what those properties needed to look like, how they should be designed, and what principles we should apply in the design of. So the guide was then endorsed by our two departments through our Accessible Homes Strategic Forum. And so it got a high level endorsement where our two departments are saying, yeah, we acknowledge we need to do this, go forth and put something together. So myself and two architects, one of them a specialist architect in design for the mind, works with the Global Brain Institute, and myself, and a small working group of a number of people, started work on this probably two and a half years ago, and something I thought would take 6 months has taken as long as it has for all sorts of different reasons. But what our guide seeks to do, and the aims, and I think it's important for me to say from the outset that it's not a regulatory document at all. We have building regulations here that obviously sort of underpin the need to comply with regulations which are legally blinding or legally binding. But this document is not that. It's really our first step at aspiring to ensure that the home environment is designed to promote the safety, comfort, independence, and general well-being of all the occupants. So that sort of approach that Per Olaf has talked about, um, to provide a reference for anyone involved in the home design process. So if I'm being honest, as an occupational therapist, my primary target was architects and designers in terms of helping to get in there at the design stage and build the principles in and get them thinking in a way around how do I make this usable for all, particularly those with cognitive and sensory impairment, and looking at the usability of the home. And I'm interested in that that language was used in Per Olaf's presentation as well, and also to look at how we could change attitudes towards inclusivity and how we build or adapt our homes. And I keep going back, this was about homes, but I'll extend that what in terms of where we hope to go with it, and promoting that designing homes for all approach to the building of adaptations and homes across Northern Ireland, and to raise awareness, actually just to get it out there, raise the profile and raise awareness amongst a range of people. And I'll talk about who the target audience are, because we wanted to encourage those who are involved in housing design and construction. So our architects, our designers, our builders, our technical staff, to consider the principles that underpin the document. We also wanted to support people with cognitive and sensory impairment, along with their families and carers, to make their own informed choices, because sometimes people just step outside of statutory provision and want to go forward and do it themselves, or they could be means tested out of it. They haven't got the financial, they have the financial means, and therefore they may have to self-fund elements of the work. But to give them a better understanding as to what they might want to consider if they are considering their design. And then, bit aspirational, but we've already started the conversation in the hope that we would influence the development of future amendments to our building standards and our regulations in Northern Ireland, which is likely to happen over the next few years. So we'd want our guide to help inform what that narrative and what that conversation might be. Our target audience for the guide really was our architects and designers, as I said, were really who I initially thought we really need to get in there at that stage. Interior designers, builders, contractors, occupational therapists who very often are prescribing and agreeing and endorsing the suitability of the accommodation, social workers who may work in sensory support teams, special educational needs staff, because I'm going to talk about the transferability across to other sectors, the housing executive, the housing associations who are social landlords here, well, three departments actually. I'll not go into the how the departments in Northern Ireland set up, but we wanted to focus on the home, we wanted to focus on the health, and we wanted to focus on the infrastructure. So we wanted to sort of inform and help to set strategy in terms of what the future might look like for new homes. And then, of course, people with, I shouldn't have them at the bottom of the list, but of course, people with disabilities and their families who are considering making changes to their home. So our consultation was extensive, probably why it took as long as it did to get to a point. So we had a number of I'm not going to go through them all: architects, user groups, carers groups, disability forums, etc., etc. So we did engage quite extensively in terms of what the content would be. And basically, what's in the guide is, we've an introduction section, and this is a whistle stop tour. So I'll give you the headlines. We've a introduction and background section where we talk about inclusive design and what we mean by that. We talk what our aims and objectives of the document. We talk about types of disability and the impact of those different types: your physical, your sensory, your cognitive. We talked about the need for it, the benefit of it, and again, this is for education and awareness purposes. The barriers to it, in terms of, when we do meet barriers from builders, designers, architects around, oh, why you can't do it. So we wanted to address that and look at how we can integrate it into project delivery, and also to talk about the importance of home, which we sometimes forget. And I know certainly in the work that I do, staff are very sometimes, particularly housing staff, can be very fixated on the systems and processes, and then as a consequence we lose sight of, well, why are we actually doing it? This is someone's home. Let's try to walk in their shoes, so to speak, and try to get an understanding from their perspective as the importance of home, and try to embed that in our thinking. at an early stage. So section 2 then goes on. We talk about key design foundations, and we've extensively researched this. There is an extensive reference section. If you don't get anything else from the guide, there's a very extensive reference section which will signpost you and direct you to a lot of the stuff that we looked at, a lot of the stuff that we reference and we saw as good practice. So if you were interested in a project, it would help to take you in a direction and find documents that you might find or papers that you might find useful. So we then talked about in our key design foundations, and there were three: optimizing that sensory load, delivering relevant information without overloading the senses. So we really wanted to simplify home design, not make it overly complex. And I think sometimes I certainly see it in public spaces a lot where architects, I think, have over designed in term focusing on the aesthetic, and as a consequence of that, maybe haven't thought through the principles. We see a lot of large glass fronted buildings now which create an awful lot of glare, and we talk in the guide about the impact of glare on people with sensory impairment and their wayfinding and their navigation and all of that. So we really focused in on simplifying the design. It doesn't have to be complex, it doesn't have to be complicated, and ultimately doesn't have to be expensive. We then talked about reducing design complexity, the visual access, so that allowing people to easily identify where they are, for helping for navigation. And the home should be set up in such a way that people know where they are. It's easy to find their living space. It's easy to find the habitable rooms, the bathroom, the kitchen, the bedroom, etc. And the final key design foundation was that access to nature. And we're all very familiar with the restorative and therapeutic benefits. I think post COVID, we've all understood that probably more than we did pre COVID about the importance of outdoor space. So we make reference to that as a key design foundation, that people can easily get out of the property, they can easily access public spaces, they can easily access their gardens, etc. So those are the key foundations that underpin the document, and they're further developed through what we call the inclusive design principles. And there's 12 of them, and I firmly believe, and we firmly believe, that these are principles that are transferable across sectors. So we're starting to have conversations with our education sector. We're starting to have conversations with our health estates, who are responsible for the design and build of new healthcare facilities, primary care facilities, GP practices, hospitals, etc., etc., about how the principles could be embedded in future design of those type of builds. Schools, we know there can be huge issues for children with sensory impairment in schools that are overloading the senses in terms of how they're designed, how they're laid out, etc. So we really want to try and transfer some of, whilst our focus is on the home, look at how it could be developed elsewhere. So the design principles, in the interest of time and the 15 minutes that we have, you'll see they're set out: safe environment, privacy, dignity, and independence, optimum levels of stimuli so that people can maximize their independence, optimum levels of light and contrast, and there's an extensive piece around light and the need for contrast and tonal contrast, and that helps with wayfinding navigation. Non-institutional and human scale environment, so not making it clinical in terms of how it's designed. Supporting orientation, so helping people find their way around, wayfinding and navigation, good visibility and visual access, access to nature, as we talked about in the foundations, promoting engagement with the family and the wider community, promoting physical and meaningful activities, and that supporting of healthy nutrition and hydration. If people can't access their kitchen and they can't find their way around it, then they're less likely to use it. So we focus in on that in terms of our principles. And then what we do is then we take people from the outside in, if you like. So we start by looking at how the principles that we've just talked about can be applied in practice. So we start with the home location and the surrounding environment. We then look at the external access, so the to the property, looking at, okay, now we're in the house, how do we get around? How do we get to the rooms that we need to get to? So internal access and circulation. And then looking at the fixtures, fittings, and the decor within the room, your floors, your walls, your toilets, etc., etc. And what you might want to consider in those. And then there's quite a bit in all of those. And then the last section looks at room layout design. So we really focus in on the most commonly, frequently used rooms or spaces, or the habitable rooms as we sometimes refer to them. So we look at the living room, kitchen, the dining room, the toilet and bathroom, and the bedrooms, which are the key spaces. And the guide then looks at a number of areas that are worth consideration and gives some hints and tips as to what you might want to consider around the character of the room, the location, the space, the view out, the daylight. We all know the importance of daylight in terms of our circadian rhythms and all of that. Looking at connection, storage, artificial lighting, I go on and on. I'll not go through them all, because it looks a bit like that. We show living rooms, and then the architect has developed some good design tips as to the location of fixtures and fittings, looking at um, the space circulation, looking at views out of the room, from the bedroom, from the living room. I can use a perfect example in my own experience. My brother-in-law is a wheelchair user, and he's also got a learning disability, and he's in care at the moment. He had to go into care. It's very complex in terms of his needs, but they moved his room, and they moved him to a room for genuine reasons. There was nothing, there was no intent in terms of what happened, but they moved him to a room that he couldn't see out the window. And very quickly that manifested itself in his behaviors. He became some difficulty communicating. If you know him, you can understand him, but if you can't, then that portrays itself in his behaviors, and his behaviors deteriorated over the 2 to 3 weeks when he was moved room, and we quickly established he can't see out anymore. So the environment actually changed his behavior. He couldn't see out to the street. He loved to watch what was going on around him. They moved him to what they thought was a bigger room, they thought was a nicer room, but he couldn't see out of it. So we quickly had to revert back and think, no, we need to rethink this. So that really opened my eyes to the importance of space, to the importance of design, to the importance of views, to the importance of seeing what's going on, and all of that. And I was able to apply the principles and say, well, look, here's the problem. We can now see that is why the behaviors have manifested, because the environment has impacted on that. Um, so I know the 15 minutes, that is a whistle stop tour. Our next steps really, and where we're at, is we did have a formal launch of the guide at the Lawn Gallery, which I have to thank Paul and Foundations, who were one of the sponsors of the document, a very kind sponsor. So we launched it at our Parliament buildings 2 weeks ago with two ministers. So we had a joint ministerial launch from the Department for Communities and the Department of Health. So it's got a profile, it's raised the profile. Our plan now is to do education and awareness sessions across the sectors. In autumn time, summer's not great for capturing the audiences, as you will know. So we're really targeting the autumn time to do more awareness sessions on the content of the guide, the embedding of the principles with our technical staff, our architects, designers, etc. We're wanting to, and have already started to engage with other departments such as education and health estates. The document is now available on the DOH and the websites, and Paul has kindly offered to host it on the foundations, where it will be available to print. If you're like myself and you like to print stuff off, and you're still a bit old school and liking paper and liking to flick through and look, then Paul has kindly offered to host that on foundation. So I will be sending a copy to Paul soon to put that up. So if people want to avail of that, they'll be able to do so. So, Paul, I am conscious that is a bit of a whistle stop tour, but I'm hoping it gives you a sense of what's in the guide. Obviously, there's a lot in it. You would need to read it, review it.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Shane. And I think it's written, isn't it, from kind of developing and designing new homes, but a lot of the principles apply to adapting homes as well. And as I said, when I came out, I think kind of particularly the section around kind of color contrast and kind of having different colored walls and floors and kind of equipment in a bathroom is, I think the section on that is really powerful and really makes the point that I suppose kind of things we talked about this afternoon in terms of aesthetic and function, and that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, are they? That quite often we design bathrooms in particular that have white tiles, white sanitary ware, white grab rails, white shower curtains, and for anybody with a kind of cognitive or sensory impairment, it can be then really difficult to work out what's what in the room, and even that, and it's not even particularly a cost saving, is it? It's um, just kind of, I suppose, kind of poor design. At, at the end of the day, it's not um, it's not functioning from a kind of cognitive and sensory perspective, even if it's working from a kind of accessible and kind of physical perspective.